This story will cover from then to now and next, all about change, how to turn losers into winners.
Patagonia. An Argentine Airlines jet arrives near Puerto Madryn. Amongst its passengers is a rather unusual kind of tourist, eco-tourists, because this is an eco-tour to Antarctica. Just down the coast is a very accessible colony of Magellanic penguins, represented by their large agent in the arrivals hall. But these eco-tourists on a quark expedition will be visiting millions of up to 6 other species of penguin far away from here. Nick Mooney is a tour leader, an expert on seabirds, and all the way from Australia. The first sight of the sea at the end of this pier is to be the travelling home for 50 somewhat adventurous people. Right now they may feel, as well as excited, a little apprehensive. It's the ship. It's Russian. The tide's out, the ship's low on the pier, and the local sea lion views the newcomers. This voyage will be seen partly from the wildlife's point of view. This could turn out to be one of the trickiest bits of the trip, and they haven't left the pier yet. It's okay for the younger ones, but for the more fragile, the gangway is a hazard. But they all get on safely, with Stuart Campbell, the main leader, and the 2 Australian doctors being the last to board, unfortunately not needed so soon.
Into the South Atlantic towards the Falkland Islands. Clear the ship.
So it's goodbye to the mainland of South America for 3 weeks. The Russian crew, with youthful captain Alexei Zakalashnyuk, is guided away by the local shipping pilot.
We'll update the situation in Antarctica later, in both parts 1 and 2.
And the first sight of some of the stars of the forthcoming show, the seabirds. This one in particular, the Pintado petrel, will feature on our Polar Eco Tour. They'll be with us all the way. From southern Argentina, we're heading southeast towards the Falkland Islands. Day 1, at sea, my first talk. They have lat and long, they pressure sensing devices. They know when the weather's going to be bad and where, and they can work around the edge of it. But it's got this sort of... Most of the tour from other countries may not know who Englishman Tony Soper is, so our first job as leaders is to make ourselves known, and the seabirds. The Pintado petrel, or Cape pigeon, is a good one for beginners. It's easy to recognize and it comes nice and close. The ship's an excellent base for seabird watching, and this one, Professor Molchanov, has an open bridge policy. Most of the time, you can watch from there. But in the right conditions, you're more part of the action out on deck. The two doctors have spotted something different. It's a tern, in trouble, but there's not much they can do to help. It's trying to land, probably exhausted. It seems to have a damaged beak, which could be a disaster for this great traveling fisherman. But at least it can rest for a while. The sea is a very big empty place if you don't normally live there. And these moths benefit from what they call assisted passage. They may stay on board until we get to the next land, where they'll hop off. But for those who live at sea, like the pintados, land is almost by the way, except of course when it comes to nesting. The ship puts you right in their world. They're equipped to live there, and so must we be.
Again, if you can't reach around because you're full of...
It's safe and warm and dry inside, but for pintado feathers, read down jacket.
Get somebody else to help you. Make sure it's secure and firm.
And please listen, Nick, even though you're one of the lecturers. Eye protection, lip protection, Michelle, the doctor, shows us. And simply life protection.
On the life jacket, it has a front and a back. On the front, it says front.
Oh, very good.
No, I don't.
And Antarctica itself needs protection too, from the likes of us. Tourists can easily cause damage and disturbance, and this tour will be closely scrutinized, independently. So we're briefed, if we've listened, Nick. The seabirds are good, and we hope albatrosses will not bring bad luck on this trip of a lifetime. The Falklands, Carcass Island, the first landing, and the weather's perfect. Will the natives be friendly?
Okay.
The local wren shouts a welcome. Kelp geese and oyster catchers don't exactly panic. And though there may be a fence, this is not a zoo. The penguins are real wild penguins. How will they react to this apparent intrusion into their lives? Actually, this bird, a striated caracara and one of the rarest in the world, is of more interest to these Gentoo penguins than us. But only for a bit. An abandoned egg makes a snack for a caracara. And a special picture for a tourist. Wildlife just carries on as if we aren't there.
upland geese. And in tussock grass, a Falklands thrush. And this is where the fence comes in, protecting the original and important tussocks from grazing by sheep. It's home for the tussock bird, at risk of being trodden on, though it doesn't mind treading on us. After splendid tea and cakes with the farmer, it's time to leave the gorse-clad shore with a confident Russian in zodiacs with which we were to trust our lives. The doctor has no problems, yet. Nor has the captain, yet. But the weather can change very quickly in these parts. No problem for an albatross, as if leading us on to our next port of call. The black-browed albatross needs wind and a rough sea to fly at its best. Using the uplift of the ridges and valleys of the ocean, it can glide for miles with hardly a flap of its great long, narrow wings. In comparison, we make ponderous and sometimes uncomfortable progress. It's one of those days you might be better off inside on the bridge. We're heading for the Albatross headquarters, a paradise for Nick Mooney, an expert on them and apples. But there are restrictions. Keep away from the sensitive, nesting giant petrels, the big relative of our constant companions, the little pintados. This is Steeple Jason Island, one of the most northwesterly of the Falklands. It's uninhabited, apart from rather a lot of these black-browed albatrosses. It's the biggest colony in the world, hundreds of thousands, and this is just a tiny part. We don't even try to count them, just try to photograph them. It's like the approach to London Airport, potentially hazardous at peak times. They ignore people completely. You could call it tameness, more likely indifference. Their main home is the sky and the sea. They're like bombers alongside the fighter squadrons of little pintado petrels to whom spray is a way of life. And the Navy's here too. The British presence is anchored off Port Stanley, the capital of the Falklands, and which featured famously in the Falklands War. For the whole 3-week trip, this is to be the most populous, inhabited port of call. Send your postcards of the cathedral and the huge whale bones, reminders of what we now regard as the bad old days. Explore the old sailing ships and consider a remote and difficult place which continues to change. Whaling, sealing, hunting penguins for their oil all took their toll. And then war. Now it's tourism and different oil from beneath the sea and a massive new fishery in it. How will all this affect what is still a pretty pristine place? Where the flightless steamer ducks have evolved the loss of flight because they've no enemies. They're good divers though, albeit in waters that are becoming increasingly polluted. By rubbish. And by sewage. Ecotourism involves people who want to be part of nature. Ecos means a house. If that house is damaged and dirty, those people won't come back, and what's more, they'll tell the rest of the world about it. The Falklands and Antarctica are cases in point, as we'll see. The expedition leader has a big responsibility to his tourists. As well as making sure they get their money's worth, and these tours are not cheap, he must look after their safety in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. And in particular, he's supposed to ensure that nature doesn't suffer from their attentions. And this record of this trip will be revealing. But here's our first wandering albatross. And our first iceberg. So far, so easy. There may be hazards ahead, as the ice suggests, but if the Russian captain and the Australian leader keep on getting it right, we're safe enough. You wouldn't want to make a mistake out here in the middle of nowhere. Shag rocks are good for shags, but not for ships. It's here we start to feel the raw power of the elements, and to admire how easily seabirds seem to cope. Not for them the comfort of the bridge. They'd hate it.
When we shall pass them, obviously if there's a chance...
Our lectures are geared to fill in the background about what you'll see next, or at least hope to. We're approaching the great island of South Georgia, with its famous whaling history. This perspective, for an audience of those who want to experience a wilderness and are mostly not nature experts, seems very welcome. That's the background. And now for the foreground. We, with the Pintado petrels of course, arrive at the Alps in mid-ocean. We've viewed the pictures, and now for the real thing. Behind the old Norwegian whaling station at Grytviken is the church, built in 1913. There's also a small museum here. The Pintados, having followed the ship to the land, may drop off here, along with 50 excited visitors. On the land, there's less excitement. This chinstrap penguin just has a quick look. The elephant seal is too bashed up to take much notice of an intrepid Dutchman, who'll get a lot more action later, and coming his way. It's deceptively quiet, somehow appropriate in a bay that saw so much death in the past. But these elephant seals are very much alive. They're just watching. They've seen the ship come in, and they're alert, ready for anything. They eat squid, not tourists. But you've got to be very careful, especially now in November when they're mating. For a seriously big animal, mating can be seriously dangerous. He moves in. Maybe he thinks the owner of the harem hasn't spotted him. How wrong can you be? It was worth a try. Perhaps try again later. As a tourist, a careful one, you can eavesdrop on these amazing sights, as intrigued perhaps as this young pup. Then it's all quiet again, except for the occasional clank of iron or the call of a tern. Our pintado shares the bay with some very tame South Georgian pintails. One can only guess at the noise there used to be when whaling was happening here. The engines, the steam, the voices, and the distant explosions of harpoons in the silent whales. Much later, the sound of a helicopter being shot down, an early victim of the Falklands War. Now, both wars are over, and South Georgia is at peace. And resting in peace behind the bay lies the boss, Ernest Shackleton, the great explorer whose extraordinary exploits make today's eco-tours seem safe and comfortable indeed. So the last Zodiac returns at the end of a memorable day. In just a generation, attitudes have greatly changed, and now ecotourism is all the rage. But at the time of wholesale whaling, killing whales was the right thing to do. Skilled, patriotic men working in the most dangerous seas in the world. On board, there's a prize for the first to see a whale. These are killer whales. A Chinese man shoots photos. Only a few nationalities shoot harpoons now. The Japanese still kill little minke whales for so-called research, and then they eat them. But whale watching is also booming in Japan. Worldwide ecotourism is increasing. It's the fastest growing sector of the tourist industry, now the biggest business in the world. Men used to land to kill thousands of penguins for their skin, their feathers, and their oil. Now penguins land to find strange creatures lying on the beach, or making curious sounds and gestures. Well, what does ecotourism mean to a leopard seal, that skinner alive of penguins? Not much, it would seem. But what does ecotourism mean to us, anyway? It's a fashionable, overused word, which can include anything from mixing with penguins in the Antarctic to a four-wheel drive adventure crashing through the African bush. A main ingredient should be respect for the place and what lives there. Minimum disturbance. Maximum benefit for the ecosystem that provides the pleasure. 50 humans amongst 50,000 king penguins surely must be a good example of that, particularly if it helps ensure the future for these birds, so slaughtered in the past. This is Salisbury Plain, or at least the hills behind it. It's cooler up here, on the snow and in the wind. Penguins are so well insulated by their feathers and their oil that they can overheat on these rare warm days. And then it's a long way back to the sea. Which at first they seem to find strangely forbidding. The attraction of these tours is the combination of accessible wildlife and a spectacular place. You're right there, and wherever you look you see penguins, seals, terns. In the case of the Arctic tern, the greatest bird tourist on Earth, which flies from one pole to the other every year and back. It's a beautiful setting that can be dangerous. Icebergs are born here, and despite the best disciplined groups, the walkie-talkies, and the most experienced leaders, there's this. Fur seals. We know this is a risky spot. An adult male fur seal is fierce and fast. They're territorial, and we're entering their territory. They're in charge. Just a paddle for defense. One got broken later by a seal. We get herded together until they lose interest. But we're after something gentler. Prion Island is the nesting place of the wandering albatross, and these chicks, maybe 9 months old, await the return of a parent, maybe even one we've seen at sea, many miles from here. We're waiting too. It's a gift to a cameraman like me. or a biologist like Nick. And eventually a gift to the chick, fish soup from the other side of the ocean and very personally delivered. And that'll have to do for some weeks. Then the adult goes past a young English lady who'll never forget this moment. Up and past a giant petrel on its nest, which just happens to be right in the takeoff zone.
In recent times, tourism in the Antarctic region has increased enormously. It has become an international struggle to win rather than to lose. Climate change is a global challenge, and looking to the future, we'll see what Antarctica faces next. Clients will pay plenty to come and be amazed by it and its inhabitants. Scientists will try to unravel its secrets. And in part 2, we'll see how the riches of these seas have become a fish fight, involving the whole ecosystem, apparently so wild and rugged, but yet so fragile.